Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here. So my copy of Spare has arrived. Here it is. I haven't finished reading it yet. I've been busy. I've got a podcast to do and I'm doing some other stuff, but I'm planning to make a video tomorrow. But I thought I'd make a little one today. I'm only about, how far have I got? I'm currently on page 77. I've had some people saying that they'd like me to go through chapter by chapter. So I'm thinking about doing that maybe once I finished it. Maybe we could break it into chapters. I could talk about stuff that I find particularly interesting with regard to family dynamics and the royal family, and just interesting like kind of social justice stuff that might be useful. If that's what you want, I've seen people saying they want that. So if you would like me to do that, I'm more than happy to. Let me know in the comments if that's what you want. But actually, there's so much to talk about, only 77 pages in. So much. I could fill so many videos with it, and I probably will. But what I wanted to talk about specifically was family dynamics and the idea of Harry as a truth teller in a family that is dysfunctional or abusive. And again, when I begin with this kind of thing, I want to say I'm not saying the royal family is an abusive family. Maybe they are, but I do think the only thing that goes in their favour here is the fact that at least they don't choose it. They are all kind of born into it. I will say that. I do have empathy for them. It's a horrible abusive system, but it's still very relatable to any of us who are from abusive or dysfunctional families, or, you know, we can relate this to oppression systems. So hopefully it's valuable to everyone. So what I wanted to talk about are the ways in which people who are abused in these systems are often smeared, but they're smeared before they can even speak. So it's the idea that in an abusive system or an abusive family, there's an awareness early on from the family that potentially someone in this system is quite observant, is quite emotionally intelligent, and can see what's going on. And when they see that early in somebody, they have to start ahead of time planning for if that person in the future then starts to realise and starts to speak. And I wanted to talk about this with regards to Harry, but also with regards to Diana. But first of all, the Independent headline today says, and the Independent is supposed to be left leaning, but as I've said before, in the UK we now have no functioning left because our Labour Party has moved into the centre, and anybody who seems to be progressive or left wing is being kind of pushed right out. So it's quite depressing. The Independent reads like a tabloid this morning. Prince Harry kidnapped by a cult of psychotherapy. And apparently if you click through to this online, it actually says Prince Harry kidnapped by a cult of psychotherapy and Meghan. Because of course, even they have to shoehorn Meghan in somehow every single time. And I was thinking about this and how some people's reactions to Harry talking about the truth as he remembers it and the truth as he feels it, and talking about these systems, has been to dismiss him as mad or unstable. So I've seen a lot of people immediately saying things like, oh, I think he seems ill, I think he seems paranoid, I think he seems crazy, I think he's imagining conspiracy. And I feel like this is so relevant to talk about because in like normal domestic abuse cases, or cases where there's a dysfunction in a family or something, these same dynamics will play out and you'll see them and you may have lived them. And if you're watching this, you're probably likely to be maybe the truth teller in your family. Maybe you are the Harry or Diana of your family. And that doesn't mean that you have to even like them or align with them politically, but you know, the person who's healthy in the family, the person who wants to challenge systems, the person who is kind of emotionally aware of what's going on, is always a threat. Even before they've said anything, that person is a threat. So in therapy, something I learned about this is the words sad, mad, and bad. And these are the three words that they use to often discredit this person that comes forward. So I feel like I don't want to get into too much detail on the whole unstable thing for Harry. Even though he is, watching him, I think it's pretty clear that he's reasoning his arguments quite rationally. He's not really being particularly emotional. He's speaking quite intelligently about things. It's very much thought out. And even then, I feel like it's really ableist, because even if he did seem like he was unstable, even if he was acting in a way that was deemed odd, it doesn't actually negate any of the things that he's saying, because we have to remember as well that something that's used on victims is sometimes victims will develop mental health issues, or their mental health issues will be made worse by stress and by the trauma of what's happened to them. So it's kind of this horrible cycle. So, you know, I feel like rather than saying, although to me I think Harry seems perfectly reasonable, I think it's also worth saying that a victim doesn't have to even seem reasonable, really. Part of the evil of it is that if you've been abused, you are probably more likely to be suffering from mental health difficulties difficulties. You will probably have been gaslit to such a degree that you might have mental health struggles. You will think you're the problem, and you might even refer to yourself as crazy. And I feel like that's a trap a lot of us fall into, because we take that role in our family. So from a very early time, we'll have kind of taken on the role that we're actually unstable, we're actually dramatic. You know, when you look at the Gabby Petito case, for example, in America, she suffered domestic abuse, and she was killed by her fiance Brian. And something that really stuck out to me, I do want to make a video about this as well. I have a lot to say on this case, and how we can learn a lot from that case, and how tragic it was for Gabby, because, you know, if you understand domestic abuse dynamics, it was just heartbreaking to see, and to also see how so many people missed the signs, how the police missed the signs, for example. But despite being abused, for example, Gabby refers to herself as having OCD, which she was never diagnosed with, and she might have had it, but it's kind of irrelevant. You will learn to explain away who you are and calling out injustice by saying, oh, you know, I'm just crazy, you know, maybe I'm the problem. And I think something that's difficult for a lot of people when they get through therapy with this kind of thing is actually understanding to kind of detach from that label and realize there wasn't actually something wrong with me. You know, I wasn't mad, and the mental health issues I did have weren't a reason to treat me that way. And in a lot of cases, you will have developed them because of that. Or they would have been used against you. You know, it's a really difficult thing, ableism. It's horrible. So the thing they tend to use against Harry, and the thing that broke my heart, is they seem to be going for stupid and naughty. And if you read the book, these are judgments on him, which he feels from when he's a little boy. And I personally found that very heartbreaking, that from such a young age, he is already thinking that he is the thick one. He's thinking that he's stupid. He's thinking he's not special. He's been brought up knowing that he is the support act to William. He doesn't think he has any gifts. He doesn't believe he doesn't believe in his own intelligence. He doesn't seem to believe in his own skills. The only thing that he seems to have any sort of confidence in is his sort of physical abilities. And even then, you can see that a lot of the time, Harry seems to be displaying quite a few self-harm behaviours, where he talks about being particularly daring, and particularly he doesn't care about his own safety. And I think that's a really big sign, especially for men who are in these situations. It can be the same for women or people of different genders, but especially for men, it can be this kind of feeling that I'm going to be as outrageous as possible. I'm going to put myself in danger because it doesn't matter to me if I get hurt. And in fact, I want to get hurt. And Harry speaks about that himself. The self-loathing and the conditioning that child went through really upset me. And it's just awful to read it, but I think it's so relevant. It's so relevant to family systems, because you see this in dysfunctional family dynamics and abusive family dynamics. It plays out the same. So before we get to Harry feeling stupid and naughty, I just want to quickly say, in terms of Diana and how this relates to how Diana's treated, because Diana was another truth teller. Diana was a threat because she had emotional intelligence and she had charisma. And whether or not people like Diana, I think you can acknowledge that she thought about things from quite an emotional lens. You know, she had emotional awareness. She did have that kind of humanity. She was very charismatic. You know, people connected to her and they liked her. But much like her son, she would always refer to herself as, you know, she had bulimia. She used to refer to herself as being chubby and being thick and all these horrible things, like, why would he want me, you know, about Charles? Nobody ever talks about how predatory that is anyway, the way that she was kind of groomed so young to go into that role, when quite clearly Charles and Camilla were in their 30s and planning to basically just use her as, you know, oh, you'll be the public face. But she wasn't in on it. You know, she really did think that this was a love situation, and she hadn't had boyfriends before. And this is not a video for me to get angry about what was done to Diana, but she hadn't had boyfriends before. The girls that Charles dated that had boyfriends before, they didn't want to be with him because they were more aware. You know, she was the perfect victim. It was really horrible. But Diana was a truth teller. And like I said, people kind of combat the truth teller in advance sometimes. So it's extremely difficult. Before that truth teller has even come into their own and become confident, they're kind of smacked with these labels before they can do it. So before the truth teller even realizes. And for sure, I think it seems that the royal family understood that Diana could be a threat if she ever came into her own power, if she ever got her own voice, if she advocated for herself, if she had support. So something they do often with women, and I think it is more successful with women. I have seen people saying that Harry's unstable, but I don't think it sticks so much with men. I think it hasn't stuck as well, and that's why they've gone for other things. But Diana was framed as mad, unstable, paranoid, and also what was so wicked is she was framed as being so immature, when what gaslighting that is, when she was chosen because she was immature. Essentially, that was why she was picked. And I don't mean immature as an insult. I mean quite literally, she was still a teenager. You know, she wasn't at that later point in her life, so she couldn't really advocate for herself. And she came from a family that was extremely troubled, and they must have known that. But Diana obviously suffered from bulimia. She suffered from anxiety. I think it feels like if she could be diagnosed today with emotionally unstable personality disorder, which I also have a diagnosis of, but I think is probably more likely. I think it gets misdiagnosed. I think that often comes from trauma. And it's also, I think, a form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So I won't get all into this now, but that's kind of what I think. Reading Diana's words and seeing her interviews, I kind of think that's what we're seeing with Diana. I think we're seeing complex trauma, and we're seeing low self-esteem, and we're seeing her being gaslit so much that she kind of doubts herself. And you'll see that Diana is, you know, constantly trying to see different therapists and do all these different holistic things and treatments, because before she becomes aware of these systems, she believes she's the problem. And that's the trap. And also, you know, Diana's breakdowns that she had, they were symptoms of the situation she was in. And I'm not saying that she wouldn't have had mental health issues if she wasn't part of that family, because we just don't know. But what we do know is that the situation she was in was high stress. She wasn't treated with kindness. There was huge stigma. The environment was not healing or affirming. In fact, in some ways it was dismissive and cruel, and she was very alone. So it made her so much worse. And this is how the cycle works, and I hope you can apply this to your own lives. She described, so in her interview that she did with Martin Bashir, which we now know that she was manipulated into, but like Harry said, it doesn't negate what she said in the interview, although it's disgusting the way they manipulated her into doing it. In that interview, Diana discusses her mental health issues, and she says, well, it gave everybody a wonderful new label. Diana's unstable. Diana's mentally imbalanced. And unfortunately, that seems to have stuck on and off over the years. So she's talking about how the label of being unstable has stuck. And it's a terrible trick that happens in these situations, because the person going through the abuse, the victim, isn't aware they're a victim. They reach out for help. They might develop unhealthy coping strategies. So Diana developed bulimia because she didn't feel in control of her environment and she didn't feel any love. And then because she had bulimia, she was then shamed, and the bulimia was used as an excuse, right? So it was like, oh, actually, Diana's just mad. Look, she's got bulimia. In fact, she's causing all the problems here. Do you see how that evil cycle works? She also described bulimia in her own words as something that happens when you're at a really low ebb. She said, you don't feel that you are worthy or valuable. And she describes it as like a comfort. So like arms around you, because she had nobody to comfort her. And she describes it as a symptom of what was going on in her marriage. So she said, it was a symptom of what was going on in my marriage. I was crying out for help, but giving the wrong signals. And people were using my bulimia as a coat on a hanger. They decided that was the problem. Diana was unstable. And this is some really twisted victim blaming, because to put somebody through so much abuse that they develop an eating disorder because of the stress and the fact that they are so gaslit, and then to turn around and say, actually, nobody's going to believe you because you're clearly crazy, you've got bulimia. Think about how evil that is. So that's what they used to do to Diana. They would also shame Diana because they'd say she was wasting food because of the bulimia. So another way to blame the victim. Don't think about why she's suffering so much from bulimia because she's being so abused. She's now the villain because she's wasting food, apparently. But something else they did to counter Diana very early on is they portrayed her as unintelligent. And she played into this, and this is the reality, and this is very difficult for victims, you know. If you're told that you're not clever, if you're told that you're lesser, if you think you're unexceptional, if you get taught that from a young age, as you get older, you start to believe it and you start to feed into it yourself. But as soon as you do, you're trapped. It's another trap. Diana speaks about this. She says, I was portrayed in the media at the time, if I remember rightly, as someone, because I hadn't passed my O-levels or taken any A-levels, who was stupid. I made the grave mistake once of saying once I was thick as a plank to ease the child's nervousness, which it did. but that headline went all around the world, and I rather regret saying it. So this was another label that was put onto Diana, and abuse victims will play into this themselves, because you don't have high self-esteem, but also because what I'm going to get to with Harry, you start to understand in a system like this, in a hierarchy system and in a dysfunctional family system, for example, that you succeeding, that you being intelligent, that you having successes is actually going to threaten other people in the family and other people in the system. So sometimes, to keep the peace, to prevent them from being jealous, to prevent yourself from being attacked, you will make yourself smaller intentionally. You might portray yourself as being unintelligent. You might really dim your light. And that's a survival mechanism. And you might do that without thinking about it. I think a lot of us, when we look back at our lives, we're able to now map that and see that that wasn't normal. But a lot of us had to dim who we were and our talents and our skills because we weren't in a situation where those things were praised. Those things caused upset because they caused jealousy for other people. And I remember in a healthy family or a healthy system, everyone should be growing together. Everyone should want the best for each other. There shouldn't be a sense of competition. If somebody you love does well, you should feel happy for them, just as they should feel happy for you if something good happens to you. And it's also really interesting that often the person who gets made into the sort of scapegoat, this truth teller role, it's a bit like Cinderella, honestly. I mean, that's a really, really old fairy tale, but there's some truth in it, essentially. If somebody has talent, if somebody is quite charismatic, if somebody is quite good and likable, the system realizes that in the future this person could be a problem, too much of a problem. So they learn to kind of dim that. They need to crush that, and fast, because it looks bad on the rest of the family. Now, in Diana's case, she's spoken about how, I mean, in some ways she was the spare, wasn't she? Because she was expected to shine, but not outshine Charles. So she was constantly trying to navigate this role in which she was supposed to be loved by the public, but also not too loved. She couldn't win. And this is something a lot of us have learned to think about, We think about pleasing people. We do ourselves down because we don't want to hurt other people's egos. But she's constantly thinking, oh gosh, I don't want to live to my full potential. I don't want to show my skills. I don't want to show who I really am. Because if I come across as more liked than my husband, or more talented in some way than my husband, or people cheer louder for me, then I'll be in trouble. I'll be punished for it. So I've got to make myself smaller. And unfortunately, in Diana's early marriage, it seems like that's what she did. She was bullied into making herself smaller because it wasn't worth the hell she got. Because again, they believe in the divine right of kings in this family, and that's why I think the family can't be reformed. It's built on hierarchy. It's not all their fault. They are like a sort of, they have to provide their own PR, and in order to do that, they have to convince us that the actual heirs are somehow better, are somehow chosen by God, deserve to be above us all. So in Diana's case, if your spouse outshines you in any way, which again, I should say, a healthy partner wouldn't see it as outshining. A healthy partner would share in it and be joyful about it. But there's competition. She can't outshine. They picked her because she had these qualities, but don't show them off too much. So it's a horrible situation for her. And now we get to Harry. Now, the same problem's happening with Harry and with William, because again, it's the idea of the heir. To go with the fairy tale of monarchy, truly, and people don't want to think about this, I don't think, we have to believe there is something inherently special and brilliant about the heir. We have to do that, and so much propaganda is put into doing that. That's why the tabloids, in a lot of ways, they won't report on the bad things about William in the press, but they will about Harry, because they have to kind of keep him, there's a sort of sanctity around William. In order for the monarchy to work, people cannot realise that William is just a guy, and they certainly can't realise that his brother might actually be more talented than him in some areas. Because that destroys the whole notion, doesn't it? It destroys the whole notion of hereditary birthright if the younger brother is in some ways more skilled than his older brother, because it makes you question the system, doesn't it? It makes you start thinking, wait, maybe people should be judged on merit rather than birth order. Harry was born into an abusive system that wasn't in his control, because he was born in that terrible bind of feeling like he had to perform, he had to make the family proud, he was on this world stage, but his whole time, his whole job is do not outshine William. Do not outshine William. And for a child, that really, really messes you up. When you get into adulthood, you find yourself holding back your talents because you're afraid that the people around you, even the adults, in these systems, you will get adults who are jealous of children, even. These systems are so toxic that you will see a child succeeding in one of these systems and the adults around them will try and sabotage them. because they can't outshine other people in the family. You know, that's how you know it's a dysfunctional system. In my own personal experience, there came a point where I had to try and pretend to be stupid, and to not be as intelligent as I was, and to kind of do myself down, and I began to learn to do that because certain adults in the family would be really angry and jealous and spiteful if I showed that I was clever, because it made them feel lesser adults doing that to a child. And this is something we see in this royal system. Like, that's why I want to talk about this stuff, because it's so applicable to these sort of dysfunctional family systems that happen all over the place that don't get this much coverage. The unspoken arrangement in these families is that in order to keep the peace, you have to remain small. So you have to grow to a certain degree because you have to shine a positive light on the family. Also, you can't go too far or be too independent. It's you're constantly having to figure out small things like how much joy you can show, if you can be proud about something, like can you share an achievement, can you share your fear, because those things will be used against you. It's this constant. I can't imagine what this must have been like for Harry, because this was not just in a family for him. This was played out in public, and I think I would have, you know, I wouldn't have been able to cope with that. I was barely able to cope with, you know, in a normal system, what that does to you. I can't imagine how he survived that. So let's talk about the two labels they gave to Harry. So obviously now they've tried to label him as unstable. They didn't do that in advance when he was a kid, because I think there's a lot of sexism involved in that. You know, I think it's something that's easier stuck on a woman, certainly. Not so easy to put that on a guy, especially not back then. They are trying their best now. They're trying to make out that him doing therapy is somehow psychobabble, and him asserting his rights and advocating for himself is somehow wrong, which it isn't wrong. Any therapist will tell you. Any therapist worth their salt will not describe that he's doing anything wrong in that sense. But the first one that really broke my heart is the idea that Harry was naughty. So from a young age, it was kind of drilled into Harry that he was the bad to William's good. And in some ways he had to do that. We know that as the spare, his role kind of was a backup if something happened to William. And it also meant, not that he knew it at the time, he needed to draw the negative attention away from William if ever William was in the spotlight. That was the contract that those boys were born into against their will. This is an extract I want to read, and it's from page 47. I forget who used the word first. Someone in the press probably, or one of my teachers. Whoever, it took hold and circulated. I'd been cast in my role in the rolling royal melodrama. Long before I was old enough to drink a beer legally, it became dogma. Harry? Yeah, he's the naughty one. Naughty became the tide I swam against, the headwind I flew against, the daily expectation I could never hope to shake. I didn't want to be naughty. I wanted to be noble. I wanted to be good. Work hard, grow up, and do something meaningful with my days. But every sin, every misstep, every setback triggered the same tired label and the same public condemnations, and therefore reinforced the conventional wisdom that I was innately naughty. This absolutely broke my heart, because children become what we make them. If you tell a child long enough that they're bad and they're naughty, that child will start to act up, because that child starts to believe that's all they are. They start to believe they're not worth anything. That's what was done to Harry, essentially, because he wasn't a naughty child at all. But they needed him. The media, you know, and again, I don't necessarily blame the family wholly, because in this situation, it's not just a dysfunctional family. The media is part of this. And it's really sick that the media were doing this, you know. It's kind of caricaturing these two little boys to make them part of their tabloid story in a way that actually harmed the children. And grown adults in the media were doing this like it was okay. And a lot of what comes later in the book that I've read, it seems to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, which I think we can kind of relate to. It's like how if in a family, if you're the scapegoat and you're constantly told you're not worth anything, you're bad, you're manipulative, you're naughty, nobody likes you, you start to believe those things. And sometimes you can become cold and you can become hard, and you can think, well, if I can do nothing right, then maybe I'll do things wrong, because at least that way, you know, at least I'm what you're telling me I am. You know, and so many people in these systems, and this is again why I hate the idea that there's a perfect victim. People will often, when a victim comes forward, they'll say, oh, well, they weren't perfect. That child was naughty. They were hard to handle. And they don't look at the fact that if a child is from a system like that, they may have become naughty or hard to handle because of that system. It's gaslighting. And also, the word naughty here, I think we need to be very careful the way we use it, because too often with children, naughty means advocating for yourself, questioning authority, These are things that are healthy. In a healthy family, these are things that should be encouraged. If you're in a family where it's naughty to question authority or to stand up for yourself even, and to say no, don't call me that, or no, don't do that to me, that's not being naughty. Not in a good and healthy place. That's not naughty. And too many children internalize the fact that they're naughty when all they are is truth tellers. That's all they are. Because we can really see as Harry gets older, he kind of leans into that. He leans into that sense of being naughty, doesn't he? He kind of thinks, well, I can't win. I've got these noble ideas. I'm good. But the media will think I'm naughty anyway. The media will think I'm bad. William's the good one. I'm meant to be the bad one. And he just kind of stops. I guess it must have felt hopeless for him. You know, what a horrible situation to have been in. And of course, the things that he does, which in some ways were because of trauma and because of undiagnosed mental health issues and because of the loss of his mother, and he's trying to cope on his own, you know, in a time where he's not really getting therapy or anything. So he's doing these more extreme things. You know, he is smoking, he is on drugs, he's trying to get a kick from something because he just feels he's traumatized. You read this and you know this is a traumatized child. All these naughty things he did came from the trauma, came from him not being able to deal with those emotions, from him shutting his emotions down and just searching for sensation. That's so common in people from these situations. And then the person who does it gets victimized again because people will point to those behaviors and say, oh, look, they're off the rails. You know, oh, look, they were doing this awful stuff, when really they were doing it because they were so numb. They were so numb and so miserable and so traumatized, and I think especially with boys. But also what I wanted to talk about here is how Harry is referred to as thick, because I've seen a lot of grown adults in the media refer to Harry as unintelligent, he's the dim one, he's thick. And first of all, I just want to say, I've said this in another video, but there's nothing to what makes you think he's thick. His arguments are well argued. They make sense from his perspective. You know, it's fine to not agree with what he says, but they're not. It's not that they don't work. It's not that what he was saying was nonsensical. And this idea that he's the thick one, he's the dim one, when obviously, you know, he's not showing any of that. But it's also the same thing they did to Diana, and that's why I wanted to start with Diana. So forgive me for starting there and moving to Harry. I wanted to kind of show how this works. Diana speaks about how, you know, she didn't really do her O-levels and her A-levels, and she called herself thick because it was to make someone laugh, and she was already used to denigrating herself. She was already used to being somebody that kind of, to make other people feel better, she made herself smaller and lesser because it made people feel more comfortable. And she was used to doing that. And a lot of us were used to doing that and have to train ourselves out of it, really. Which is why it's so evil when it's referred to as narcissistic or arrogant for someone to have boundaries and to advocate for themselves. Because you're usually looking at somebody who's never had boundaries, who's never been allowed to advocate for themselves, and is doing it for the first time. Something Harry talks about here, which I wanted to read this particular passage, because trauma, and I don't just mean the trauma of losing his mother, but also the trauma of the system he was in, the dynamics of that system and what that meant for him. Trauma does impact the way your mind works. It impacts your memory and the way you're able to like stay on a topic. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, for example, I have ADHD. I've been diagnosed with ADHD. But I think in some ways my issues with concentration and stuff developed, or I have like either intense focus on something, I intensely focus on it to the exclusion of all else, or I find it hard to focus at all. And I think a lot of that comes from trauma, because when you're in a traumatic situation, your brain acts in a way to try and protect you from harm. So often if something bad happens, your brain will try and take you out of your body, so you'll kind of detach and derealise from it. It will become a distant thing you don't want to deal with in your head. And you might even erase things that are very, very painful, because your brain knows that if you ever look at the system, you know, and you look at this pattern of behaviour, you have to accept that you've been incredibly hurt and you're on your own. And there's no protection, and that's terrifying. That's terrifying for a child. That's absolutely horrifying. So what your brain does when you're under extreme anxiety and pressure is it kind of prevents you from thinking about things too deeply. So you kind of skirt things, you know, you'll find yourself, you're in the room, but you're not paying attention, because if you think too deeply about the stuff that's going on, you will fall apart. You won't be able to cope. And when you're young, when you're not an adult and you're going through that helps you survive. That's a survival instinct. It's meant to protect you in that moment. But as you get older, it really messes you up. And this is what Harry kind of talks about here. Because he talks about, like Diana, he says he didn't do well at school. He found it very hard to concentrate. And I just want to say that is not the sign of somebody that's unintelligent. There is a huge difference between not being able to concentrate and not being academic. I mean, also, there's so many different ways to be intelligent. It doesn't really matter if someone's academically intelligent or not. There's so many different ways. But so often an inability to focus, which is a trauma thing, is attributed to, oh, that person's thick. They're thick. Okay, so this I thought was very interesting. Study, concentration, requires an alliance with the mind. And in my teen years, I was waging an all-out war with mine. I was forever fending off its darkest thoughts, its basest fears, its fondest memories. The fonder the memory, the deeper the ache. I'd found strategies for doing this, some healthy, some not, but all quite effective. And whenever they were unavailable, for instance, when I was forced to sit quietly with a book, I freaked out. Naturally, I avoided such situations. At all costs, I avoided sitting quietly with a book. It struck me at some point that the whole basis of education was memory. A list of names, a column of numbers, a mathematical formula, a beautiful poem. To learn it, you had to upload it to the part of the brain that stored stuff. But that was the same part of the brain I was resisting. My memory had been spotty since Mummy disappeared, by design, and I didn't want to fix it, because memory equaled grief. And I feel like if you relate to that, then I'm completely with you, because I had similar struggles where sometimes I was so checked out because I didn't want to think about things deeply. I didn't want to have to think about trauma, and I didn't want to have to accept trauma and the actual stuff that was going on. So I think I just checked out. And for me, I hyper-focused, so that can be another thing. Like, I would become extremely obsessed with things. So like the Tudors, for example, or Doctor Who, I became just totally obsessed, because if my mind ever wandered, if there was ever a moment when my mind wasn't occupied, it would think about trauma. It would think about the trauma, and I would become terrified because there was nothing I could do, and I would fall apart. And so my mind gave me hyper-focus, or it made me not focus on anything at all. So I became very jittery, very jumpy, you know, I couldn't focus in class. I was struggling with things like maths, where you have to remember numbers and sequences, because that was too dangerous for me. I couldn't. I became someone who tapped my foot all the time. I could feel that same restlessness in Harry. I could feel that reading this. I grieved for him. I really grieved for him reading this. It's incredibly relatable if you've been through that situation. Some of this stuff is so painful to unpack that you have to do it bit by bit as an adult. That's a process. I'm still doing it bit by bit as an adult, because to do it all at once would destroy you. We also see him comparing himself to his dad, you know. He says, difficult as it was for me to be the naughty one and the stupid one, it was anguish for Pa, because it meant I was his opposite. And he talks about, you know, how his father's really into Shakespeare. And I would argue, as someone who's literally got my degree, first class degree in English literature, and my master's in creative writing, just liking Shakespeare doesn't make you more intelligent, you know. In fact, what Harry says about how he related to John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and the themes in that, to me, displays quite strong intelligence in Harry, the way he engages with that text. And there is a sort of way that people think intelligence shows itself, and so often people mistake good memory for intelligence. I just have to say that. You know, he even talks about how, you know, Hamlet reminds him too much of his own life, and so he shuts it. And he's kind of glib when he's writing this. It's a bit of a joke, but, you know, I understand that. You know, you will run from things. You'll do one of two things. You'll either over-identify, and that's how you'll process, or you just won't be able to attach at all. And you will find yourself so triggered. And at a time when, you know, I don't know how old you guys are watching this. If you're my age or older, if that happened to you and you felt triggered, there wasn't a word for it. You couldn't just be like, oh, I feel triggered by this. Your mind would just escape. Your mind protects you by, if you have to sit in that room, your mind is escaping. And that's difficult, because you can go through a whole class in school and not remember what happened in the lesson. That used to happen to me all the time, apart from when I hyper-focused. There's also this other thing here, you know, where Harry talks about going to Eton. He describes Eton as heaven for brilliant boys. It could thus only be purgatory for one very unbrilliant boy. I think I'm going to leave it there. I could get into this in so much more detail, but I will as we go through the chapters, and I'll probably, if you want me to make videos about family dynamics and these kind of things, I can. What we're seeing in Harry is, I think, somebody who has always had quite an innate emotional intelligence. You can see a lot of similarities to Diana. You know, there is emotional intelligence there's an ability to look at systems, there's an intelligence in the way that he questions things, which I don't think he even understands at this point, because if we think about how indoctrinated and groomed he's been, for him to even be at this point is quite remarkable, and that's a skill. But unfortunately, it's those people in these systems that are often attacked the most, and are often kept down the most, and punished for anything that gets towards independence, or anything that makes them special. Now, in a normal's not the right word, a dysfunctional or abusive family, the roles aren't necessarily so set. So this is quite different, because obviously William is born to be the heir, so there's no question the moment Harry's born, he's got to be the scapegoat. He's got to be the second one. I wonder if they were in a different family, I wonder if it had been the other way round. You know, might it have been that Harry was the golden child and William was the scapegoat? And how might things have been different? Because children in these systems are innocent. They make their choices as adults, but children in the systems are completely innocent. Somebody that's smart enough to see what's going on, and again, if they see this in you as a child, they have to think in advance. And that's why it's often so difficult for victims to come forward when it comes to family abuse and family dynamics. Because all these kind of hurdles have already been set up before you get there. You know, that person is unstable. That person is untrustworthy. Oh, their memory seems a bit dodgy. That person agreed that they were stupid. Oh, they were naughty. Weren't they moody? Truth tellers like this are a threat. They're a threat to any oppressive system. They're a threat to a dysfunctional family system that runs on abuse, because they could potentially in the future see it and call it out. So yeah, they get called mad, sad, or bad. And that's a way that we destroy victims before they're even able to identify themselves as victims, so that by the time they come forward, they're already being victim blamed. This is a really long one, but I hope it was helpful in some way. I am going to go through this more if you would like me to. But yeah, I've got a podcast to record, so I'm off for now. But I love you loads and I hope you're all right. All right, love you. Bye.